As we often say, the United States and the United Kingdom often have strong influences on each other. What's happening on one side of the Atlantic often manages to reach the other side. Just like the eugenics movement by Francis Galton started in Great Britain and made its way across to the United States, the drug experimentation mentioned earlier in the Willowbrook scandal made its way across to the UK. Someone called Dinah Murray played an important role in stopping the over-medication and experimentation on the intellectually disabled and autistic people. In 1998, Dinah Murray founded a campaign called Autistic People Against Neuroleptic Abuse, abbreviated as APANA. In the mid-90s, Dinah Murray was a support worker for people with learning disabilities, including autism and intellectual disability, who was discharged from the National Health Service into the community. This neuroleptic abuse stems from what someone called Alicia A. Broderick calls the autism industrial complex. Through her research in the foundation of the pharmaceutical industry, Professor Alicia A. Broderick concludes that what autism is seen as today can only be understood within capitalism itself. I then take things a step further, and I actually think this could be applied to medical science in general, especially when we look at how the DSM and ICD have developed. Dinah Murray became obsessed with the over-medication and did deep research into it. She was gathering records, data, sound effects, and accounts by those who'd already fallen victim. Dinah Murray said, I quote, "The period when our people had been hospitalized was a period of excited experimentation with new drugs, and the doctors really had no idea what they were doing when they prescribed dosages of chlorpromazine, an antipsychotic, to children, which would later be regarded as around 12 times the recommended maximum. I was in tears too. As I got deeper into the general research I was doing, I became more and more horror-struck by the great range of problematic features of the whole psychotropic prescribing business, which was stripped bare in the power structures in which people with no information and no voice were ultimately vulnerable." End of quote. Dinah Murray came to find these drugs can even kill people. The purpose of prescribing this medication was not to help the disabled people, but was to modify their behavior to comfort the majority. Rather than seeing behaviors as signs of stress, anxiety, or trauma in need of relief, they looked down on the disabled as social parasites. People need to be changed and fixed, just as did the eugenicists. Remember, the eugenics movement never actually did cease, but they just began hiding in the shadows. On all the recorded scientific conclusions, the success rates had nothing to do with the health and well-being. Success was measured by reduced behaviors. They were still considered successful when they harmed the disabled people, as long as it reduced socially undesirable behaviors. That's clearly just a pharmaceutical version of abuse for self-satisfaction. It never was about helping patients. It was just greed and selfishness. I still see this selfishness and greed in some people and therapists today. Each time I see a parent or carer moan and groan about their child being disabled, they never mention how the disability affects their child. They only ever talk about how not having the child they expected affects them. They prefer to keep abusing their own children to modify behaviour to get the child they expected. Murray resigned as a support worker and became a relief worker. A pharmacologist called Paul Shattock was concerned about the use of neuroleptics for behaviour modification. Dinah attended an autism conference in Europe. Paul introduced Dinah to a concerned mother from the UK. Meeting concerned parents was the first step to gathering activists to help protest against neuroleptics. This group became Autistic People Against Neuroleptic Abuse. The purpose of APANA was to raise awareness of all the pharmaceutical abuse being done in the name of care, just as has been done with applied behaviour analysis. Autistic People Against Neuroleptic Abuse recruited two autistic people called David Andrews and Wendy Lawson, now known as Wen Lawson, as chairperson and patron. The rest recruited were all parents of adults they had seen harmed by psychiatric treatment. Dinah was spending more time reading research. Dinah discovered that an unexpected result of the hospital closures was that prescriptions of psychotropic had increased as neighbours in the community complained. As Dinah Murray and APANA attended and shared their research, more people, including learning disability specialists, started taking their message of abuse in care by suppressing behaviours through psychotropic pills. Once the abuse became public concern, the NHS and government couldn't leave things the way they were. Murray and Autistic People Against Neuroleptic Abuse provided overwhelming evidence from research that it was just as harmful and immoral to prescribe such pills with so little evidence just for experimentation without informed consent, just as was the Willowbrook scandal. A man called Jim Sinclair in the early 90s played a very influential role in starting the neurodiversity movement. In 1993, Jim Sinclair wrote an article with parents being his target audience. His article is still commonly cited over 30 years after its publication. Don't Mourn for Us could be described as an attack on parents and autism researchers. When I read his publication, I could see it differed from the writings of Temple Grandin and Donna Williams' publications. While Grandin and Williams' writing still relied on the ableist assumptions and what Sinclair called parent-centric culture, parent-centric culture still today talks about autism as if we are inevitably a tragedy and financial burden. He challenged parents and researchers by basing his publication on autistic narration. In his article, he writes, I quote, "Autism is a way of being. It is pervasive. It colours every experience, every sensation, perception, thought, emotion, and encounter, every aspect of existence. It is not possible to separate the autism from the person, and if it were possible, the person you'd have left would not be the same person you started with. This is important, so take a moment to consider it. Autism is a way of being. It is not possible to separate the person from the autism. Therefore, when parents say, I wish my child did not have autism, what they're really saying is, I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, and I had a different, non-autistic child instead." Read that again. This is what we hear when you mourn over our existence. This is what we hear when you pray for a cure. This is what we know when you tell us of your fondest hopes and dreams for us. that your greatest wish is that one day we will cease to be, and strangers you can love will move in behind our faces. End of quote. From my view, what I quoted by Jim Sinclair sounds like someone shunning parents for their grief. When Jim Sinclair's claims are applied to the world, he was simply telling the truth. In the past, the term autistic was used as an insult. After this article, the term autistic was redefined and turned into what we call identity-first language, aka autistic person, instead of person with autism. The with is indicating that the person and autism are two separate entities, as if autism is a disease. Surveys consistently show that approximately 90% of people on the autism spectrum prefer to identify as autistic people, but autistic is no longer used as an insult. In Jim Sinclair's publication, he pointed out that much of the suffering autistic people experience does not stem from the autism itself, but stems from parents and researchers stigmatizing them. In 1994, Asperger's syndrome was added to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. By doing so, more people who could speak on behalf of themselves were diagnosed and began speaking up, narrating their own experiences, calling parents and autism researchers out for all their abuse towards their own children. The very people researchers claim to be helping put them in fear of the public. The autistic voices were online now, in the public eye, screaming out, "My parents and autism researchers are abusing me and hate me. Help me." That would surely make parents and researchers self-reflect on their goals and priorities. I don't know anyone who wants to be seen by the public as a child-abusing parent or organization. This brought the field of autism research into the crisis we needed to cause a change of direction. Further in Jim Sinclair's article, "Don't Mourn for Us," he wrote, "You didn't lose a child to autism. You lost a child because the child you waited for never came into existence. That isn't the fault of the autistic child who does exist, and it shouldn't be our burden. We need and deserve families who can see us and value us for ourselves, not families whose vision of us is obscured by the ghosts of children who never lived. Grieve, if you must, for your own lost dreams, but don't mourn for us. We are alive, we are real, and we're here waiting for you." End of quote. When parents talk to me like this, when I talk about autism or debunk stigma and stereotypes, they always claim autistic people are a burden to the world. Just like Jim Sinclair said, it shouldn't be our burden. It's true. I inform the parents who are unaccepting of their child that society is a burden to us who are autistic. All the historical events I've mentioned up to now throughout this video, how on earth was that not society being a burden to the disabled people? If you claim a disabled person is a burden and don't like burdens, don't look in the mirror, as you'll just see someone who is an even bigger burden. During the 21st century, autistic people and other neurodiversity activists have created enormous shifts in socio-political matters relating to autism, research and interventions. In the mid-1990s, shortly after Jim Sinclair's publication, "Don't Mourn for Us," autistic people began uniting over the internet. With the internet being a global communication tool, it became easier to find other autistic people. both sharing their experiences and ideas of how to stop the abuse. Autistic people made online social communities, and an autistic culture was formed. As the autistic culture grew, it emerged into the autistic self-advocacy movement, redefining autism as a valid way of being, as Sinclair's publication said. Other neurodivergent people began joining the autistic culture as they were in the same position. In 1998, the sociologist Judy Sinner popularized the term neurodiversity, giving rise to the neurodiversity movement. During the 21st century, the noise from autistic voices has put so much pressure on parents, carers, social workers, researchers, the whole field associated with autism, and even infiltrated autism research. Autistic Voices Online and autistic autism researchers have debunked numerous claims by ableist autism researchers, providing so much that was being said about them was incorrect. By the autism self-advocacy movement becoming the neurodiversity movement, it was no longer just autistic voices. All kinds of neurodivergent people have raised their voices, which have strongly influenced academia, clinical practices, resetting the understanding of autism and other neurological differences. As new social media platforms arose, it was almost unavoidable to not see criticisms towards 20th century autism research and applied behaviour analysis. On 21st of January 2020, someone called Alfie Kahn wrote a blog himself saying, I quote, "But even more compelling is the testimony of young people who understand the reality of this approach better than anyone, because they've been on the receiving end of it. It is nothing short of stunning to learn just how widely and intensely ABA is loved by autistic adults who are able to describe their experience with it. Frankly, I'm embarrassed that until about a year ago, I was completely unaware of all the websites, articles, scholarly essays, blog posts, Facebook pages, and Twitter groups featuring the voices of autistic men and women, all overwhelmingly critical of ABA and eloquent in describing the trauma that is its primary legacy." End of quote. In 2013, the American Psychiatric Association only made the noise louder by opposing many psychiatrists and the DSM 4th edition committee by publishing the DSM 5th edition. The DSM 5th edition broadened the autism spectrum and added other so-called disorders to the manual. Then more people became worthy of a diagnosis that by 2015, an online war has been occurring, you could say, by so-called normal people refusing to accept autistic differences. An us versus them mentality was produced, with the normal people seen as an oppressive force against the disabled. A central premise of the neurodiversity movement is to accept natural variations in human neurological development. All humans are natural and equal in value, but neurodiversity is all neurological variations among the human population and not necessarily forms of pathology. The neurodiversity movement intersects with the disability rights movement. According to both movements, disability is not a defect in an individual. It is seen as the result of an unaccommodated individual based on the social model of disability. Consistent in this stance, neurodiversity proponents view autism as a disability. Stephen K. Capp asked autistic individuals, "What is neurodiversity in your own words?" According to the results, no participants highlighted specific abilities seen as good or bad, nor did they see autism as an advantage. They saw themselves as socially disadvantaged. From this theory, the neurodiversity movement makes many demands to recognize and accept that genetic, cognitive, and brain differences have value to offer society, enhancing biological variation and equal rights to put a stop to the discriminatory practices and abuse. An organization called the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network was founded just at the start of the 21st century and have been running a campaign called Stop the Shock. They say, I quote, "People with disabilities and our allies have been fighting to stop the JRC. We want to stop people at the JRC from getting shocked. We've been working together to try to stop the JRC for more than 10 years. We call our campaign Stop the Shock." End of quote. Steve Silverman, author of Neurotribes, says 132 kids in California got the measles by either visiting Disneyland or being exposed to someone who'd been there. The virus then hopped the Canadian border, infecting more than 100 children in Quebec. An effective vaccine against it has been available for more than half a century, but many of the kids involved in the Disneyland outbreak had not been vaccinated because their parents were afraid of something allegedly even worse, autism. End of quote. The disaster Steve Silverman mentions, the Disneyland outbreak, was caused by a former doctor called Andrew Wakefield. Andrew Wakefield was found to be fraudulent and caused this for fame and financial gain. When doctors or scientists are being quiet, it's time to hold them suspect. Another doctor called Dr. He, a Chinese scientist, secretly editing embryos behind everyone's back with the motive to gain a reward, competing against Jennifer Doudna, who was awarded for CRISPR in 2020. Just like Dr. He caused a global outcry against editing embryos, Andrew Wakefield's actions caused an outcry to stop vaccinations with MMR. Andrew Wakefield asserted the MMR vaccine with bowel diseases and autism, leading to the belief that vaccinations are the cause of autism. Personally, I found this theory ridiculous and hard to believe anyone believed him. We already knew autism is primarily genetic. By this time, through genetic and genomic research, we knew autism was among the human population thousands of years ago. We didn't have vaccines thousands of years ago. These facts make me ask the question, when there were no vaccines, what was causing autism? I mean, there couldn't have been vaccines. Further questions I asked. Nearly all children were vaccinated with MMR for several generations already. So one of the majority who were vaccinated be worthy of an autism diagnosis. Since approximately 1 to 2% of the world's population are estimated to be autistic, that's further evidence that MMR vaccine is not the cause of autism. We need to remember, correlation doesn't equal causation. Just to illustrate, all autistic people have a heart. Does that mean having a heart is the cause of autism? Obviously not. An organization called Autism Speaks made this even worse. Suzanne and Bob Wright, co-founders of Autism Speaks, used this to frighten the world, to believe autism is an epidemic child abducting disease. Andrew Wakefield had no evidence for his claim to begin with, so it wasn't even a legitimate hypothesis. His sample size was 12 alleged autistic children. That's a very small sample size to come to an objective conclusion, and his data was based on anecdotes. 8 out of 12 parents reported their children began exhibiting autism traits. But here's the important question. Were they actually autistic traits? Recall what I wrote Dr. Bruce Perry said, that the DSM diagnoses are just hollow descriptors, that each trait has hundreds of physiological roots, and we would just get garbage. A journalist called Brian Deere was greatly researching and questioning all behind Andrew Wakefield's project, and the information he collected exposed the project as financial fraud. A paper of the project was published on the 28th of February 1998 and retracted on the 2nd of February 2010. Brian Deere spoke with some of the parents who believed that MMR caused their child's autism. Some objected to the published paper, saying the recorded data is not true. When they looked at the paper together, they could see the data was clearly distorted. Brian Deere said, I quote, "My investigation of the MMR issue exposed the frauds behind Wakefield's research, triggering the longest ever UK General Medical Council fitness to practice hearing and forcing the Lancet to retract the paper. Last May, it led to Wakefield and Walker Smith being struck off the medical register." End of quote. Someone called Rosemary Keswick, former CEO of AII, Allergy-Induced Autism, a UK-based charity trying to identify the underlying causes, biochemical effects, and dietary aspects of autism, together with the National Autistic Society and PACE, Parents Autism Campaign for Education, AIA formed the Joint Advisory Committee to the UK all-party parliamentary group on autism. As the mother of a now adult son with autism and inflammatory bowel disease, whose condition has been dramatically improved with appropriate medical and dietary intervention, Rosemary championed the need for recognition of gastrointestinal disease in autistic children and adults, and was instrumental in its inclusion as a key theme in the autism exemplar of the National Service Framework. I've never had any kind of bowel disease whatsoever. I don't have any gastrointestinal disease. I've never been diagnosed with one. So if that was the cause, well, why don't I have it? This only reinforced Andrew Wakefield's conspiracy, spreading it onto both sides of the Atlantic, trying to define autism as an epidemic disease. She suggested debunked gluten-free diets cure autism, while saying MMR caused her son autism. Rosemary claimed dietary and medical interventions improved her son's health. This is easy to debunk. If she used both gluten-free diets and medical interventions combined, she cannot validly claim gluten-free diets help because there's no way to prove the medical interventions alone weren't responsible for increased well-being, or whether the diet alone was responsible for increased well-being. However, physician Michael Fitzpatrick, the author of Defeating Autism, A Damaging Delusion, offers a critical perspective on this trend. I quote, "As more and more parents of children with autism have been drawn into anti-vaccine campaigns and the pursuit of unorthodox biomedical therapies, I have become increasingly concerned at the damaging consequences of the quest to defeat autism. The movement that has advanced under this banner on both sides of the Atlantic seeks to redefine autism as an epidemic disease caused by vaccines or some other, as yet unidentified, environmental factor. Despite the lack of scientific support for this theory, it has acquired the character of a dogmatic conviction for many who uphold it. In the face of all contradictory evidence, parents who share this faith are subjecting their children to treatments for which there is no coherent scientific rationale. End of quote. Before we move further, allow me to share something which made things even worse. Not only did Suzanne and Bob Wright participate in anti-vaccine campaigns, celebrities in the public eye like Jim Carrey and Donald Trump were preaching anti-vaccine campaigns, with Andrew Wakefield in the United Kingdom spreading doubt on vaccines for fame and financial gain, and Kerry and Trump in the US. Now the anti-vaccine campaigns were on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Jim Carrey said, I quote, Dr. Andrew Wakefield is being discredited to prevent a historic study from being published that for the first time looks at vaccinated versus unvaccinated primates and compares health outcomes, with potentially devastating consequences for vaccine makers and public health officials. End of quote. Someone called Andrew Buncombe from the Independent on the 5th of May 2018 said, I quote, on more than 20 occasions, Mr. Trump has tweeted about there being a link between vaccines and autism, something experts at the government's leading public health institutes say is not true. He also repeated the claim during a Republican primary debate, a remark that was immediately dismissed as false by the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. End of quote. When I discuss capitalism and the autism industrial complex, Professor Alicia A. Broderick's work, it will become even more understandable why celebrities took such things for granted. I'm just going to share with you a piece of Professor Broderick's research involving what Donald Trump did during his time as president. Professor Alicia Broderick writes, I quote, more recently, in 2019, President Trump signed into law the Autism Collaboration, Accountability, Research, Education and Support Act, aka the Autism Cares Act, a reauthorization of the Autism Cares Act of 2014, itself a reauthorization and renaming the Combating Autism Act of 2006, which allocates $1.8 billion across fiscal years 2020 to 2024. The reauthorization law now requires the National Institutes of Health to fund research into developmental, behavioral, and clinical psychology, in addition to its extant mandates to fund research into the neurobiology, genetics, and genomics of autism, both feeding and subsidizing both intervention and prevention industries with federal funding. End of quote. Andrew Wakefield's project was a deception. The published paper contained intentional lies to have the data he wanted. Before he even did the project, he had a vaccine of his own making, but he wouldn't be able to sell it as long as MMR was still in use. Wakefield kept claiming it's better to take the vaccine separately so he could replace the MMR, he said, causes autism. Other professionals, as well as Brian Deere, were strongly questioning him. They wanted greater evidence of his claims. This brought Wakefield a problem. He required autistic volunteers as participants to conduct a study. He gained volunteers, but he harmed these autistic children in the process. Andrew Wakefield failed to inform volunteers of all side effects and potential dangers by participating. The other doctors and nurses in the study saw it as unethical. Physical restraint was used on the children. Informed consent includes the right to withdraw, keeping them in pain. Brian Deere exposed the financial conflict of interest on television and a documentary. Once Wakefield was exposed, he left the UK and immigrated to Florida to continue living by his lies, running anti-vaccine campaigns. The anti-vaccine campaigners pay Andrew Wakefield still to this day by purchasing his products, his fake cures to autism. Wakefield even discouraged people from taking the vaccine for the COVID-19 pandemic. Just like the events discussed previously, an organization called Autism Speaks has a very dark history. Autism Speaks was co-founded in 2005 by Susan Wright and Bob Wright. They were influenced by their grandson being diagnosed autistic to start the organization. Suzanne and Bob played a great role in creating the autism industrial complex to gain federal funding for applied behavior analysis across all 50 states in the US. It has always been an ableist organization that supports parents rather than autistic people themselves. The first 5 years, 2005 to 2010, is when some of its darkest events occurred. During their earliest of years, they made advertisements and videos to bombard the world with fear-mongering, information about having autistic children, wanting to eradicate autism. Susan Wright said, I quote, "If we continue our current trajectory, we'll get there in my lifetime." End of quote. Susan Wright died of cancer in 2016. Fortunately, she didn't manage to complete her mission. Two of their worst videos were called I Am Autism and Autism Every Day. I Am Autism described and depicted autistic children as demons who are lost, and that autism is some child abducting monster worse than cancer, AIDS, and diabetes combined. Autistic people were extremely offended by it. Autism Every Day had a mother saying right in front of her autistic daughter she wanted to put her in the car and drive them off of the George Washington Bridge to kill her own daughter and herself. She then reveals the only reason she didn't do it is because she had a non-autistic daughter. All their advocacy wasn't for the benefit of autistic people, but was to scare parents to help contribute towards the autism industrial complex. Professor Alicia Ray Broderick says, I quote, "During those first 5 years, many autistic activists and academics, myself included, were reactively responding to the dehumanizing, fear-mongering rhetoric of Autism Speaks, as if the organization were merely unimaginably ignorant and needed to be better educated about the perspectives and agendas of autistic people. But cultural fear-mongering has been a tried and true tactic of fundraising and electoral politics since time immemorial. Why on earth wouldn't it have been deployed in this case?" End of quote. All the fear-mongering Autism Speaks was doing generated lots of donations and income. The persistent dehumanization enabled Autism Speaks to write a cultural and worldly narrative of what autism is. As we know, Andrew Wakefield was a fraud, and actually still is a fraud, causing anti-vaccine campaigns. Suzanne and Bob Wright used this to their advantage. Change is usually the result of a crisis. So to change the public's perspective, they preached Wakefield's conspiracy as truth and used the graph calling it autism prevalence rate, only showing rapidly increasing numbers. People did not know the context behind the numbers, which made them see autism as an epidemic disease. The DSM 4th edition is what caused the rapid increase. In earlier chapters, he explained how Leo Connor's view of autism was too narrow. Each time they revised the DSM, they broadened the autism spectrum using sly tricks. This belief in an epidemic disease made people empty their wallets and donate to Autism Speaks to stop and prevent this autism crisis before it got to their children. Suzanne and Bob did not stop telling people vaccines cause autism until 2016 after Suzanne's death. Autism Speaks has always had more to do with supporting parents. They didn't employ anyone autistic to work for them. They probably knew an autistic person wouldn't talk about autism as if it's a ghost or child abducting alien. In July 2012, someone called John Elder Robinson, the first autistic person to associate with Autism Speaks, attended a strategic meeting for Autism Speaks in San Francisco. He proposed that Autism Speaks should drop the word cure from their research. All the scientists agreed looking for a cure was an unrealistic goal, but Autism Speaks didn't agree. In October 2013, Autism Speaks announced another summit to be held in Washington, D.C. There was not a single autistic person invited to attend. Then in November, Susan Wright followed that up with a truly horrific op-ed. She suggested that millions of autistic people were lost, taken from society by the monster, autism. She said families with autistic people were barely living. John Robinson began being harassed by the autism community. Over 100 autistic people wrote to him, asking how he could associate with Autism Speaks, having such ideas. After this experience, John wrote a letter to Liz Feld, the president of Autism Speaks, saying, I quote, Autism Speaks is never going to be accepted by the broader community of autistic people if they continue the fear-mongering and sick child talk. This kind of talk does not do any of us any good. The idea that Mrs. Wright would once again convene a summit without any meaningful autistic representation is extremely troubling to me, particularly because we've covered this issue before. I'm starting to feel Mrs. Wright is in a very different place than most of the people I see in the autism community. Is Autism Speaks going to be able to shift its focus away from her diseased child model to focus on consulting with autistic people of all ages about how their needs might best be served in a non-fear driven environment? End of quote. John said he hadn't received a response after 2.5 days from President Liz Feld. He chose to leave, and numerous autistic people began writing to him again, strongly supporting him on his decision. In the first 8 years of Autism Speaks, they had only spoken to one autistic person, John Elder Robinson. Autism Speaks is the wealthiest business associated with autism because they are actually capitalist, tax lawyers, and lobbyists who took a page out of the capitalist playbook. Professor Alicia Broderick says again, I quote, "The overarching strategy connecting these two rhetorical contributions becomes obvious when examined through the lens of the AIC. That is, when one understands the agenda and activities of Autism Speaks, not as those of an organization involved in autism advocacy or science, but rather as those of a cooperative-style lobbyist for the autism, both intervention and prevention industries. The first 5 years of Autism Speaks produced ubiquitous and menacing PSAs, fundraising films, and media blitzes, all apparently designed to groom media consumers to identify with and feel the fear of non-autistic parents, to loosen their own wallets by contributing to fundraising initiatives, and to back, or at least not block, Autism Speaks' legislative agenda." End of quote. Autism Speaks adopted a logo from the National Autistic Society in the UK of a jigsaw piece completely blue. The jigsaw piece is meant to paint autistic people as some kind of puzzle to be solved, with a part of them lost or missing. The reason their logo was entirely blue until 2020 is because blue represents depression and disappointment, as if it's depressing and disappointing to have an autistic child. They started a campaign called Light It Up Blue, as in light autism, up blue as a disease. The autistic community reacted and started a campaign called Light It Up Red to oppose the Autism Speaks' message, with red representing warmth and love. In 2016, Autism Speaks started a project called Missing. Missing It is a groundbreaking collaboration between Autism Speaks, Verily, DNA Stack, Hospital for Sick Children, Sick Kids, and the research community to create the world's largest whole genome sequencing database on autism with deep phenotyping. End of quote. The only way genome research could help autistic people is through genetic engineering and eugenic practices, which is not supporting or advocating for autistic people, but their non-autistic parents. In 2016, after the project, co-founder Bob Wright steps down from leadership. For over a decade, Autism Speaks never intended to help autistic people. It was always about the money and despicably using the public to get what they wanted, and still are. For the first 11 years from their foundation, they did nothing but abuse the autistic community. That's why there is such great controversy all over the internet of autistic people telling everyone to not support Autism Speaks, as it's not a supportive group. Once Suzanne and Bob Wright and Liz Feld left Autism Speaks, the organization's attitude and goals appear to have changed. To me, it looks like all the abuse and controversy was caused by the co-founders and leaders of Autism Speaks. There's a page on their website addressing the common criticisms towards Autism Speaks, and in recent years, they began including autistic people themselves. However, because of all the abuse, they lost the autistic community's trust, and they could always just be doing this to play a trick on the autistic people, to continue getting our money, as they know that the branding has changed, that people won't go just accepting their old ways. So they need to change in order to continue getting the money. There's still autistic people who don't trust them. Personally, I think if anyone's going to trust them, it will take at least a decade to clean up their trash and gain enough trust from the autistic community. Autism Speaks says, I quote, "Since our founding, we have worked hard to accurately portray the wide range of experiences one may have with autism, and unfortunately, sometimes we have missed the mark. In 2009, a video called I Am Autism was published, which represented autism as a burden to families. This video is in no way reflective of the Autism Speaks of today. This video has been a great regret in the history of our organization, and we deeply apologize to those who we offended with it." End of quote. No, this was not written by the co-founders, Suzanne and Bob Wright. From what we witnessed, they had no intention to portray autism accurately. Like it was already well known, autism has no link to vaccinations, and Andrew Wakefield's project was fraud. So why did they keep preaching vaccines cause autism until 2016, when Andrew Wakefield's paper had been retracted 6 years prior? That was clearly not just a mistake. It was their intention to misrepresent autism. Ever since the right stepped down, those who work for Autism Speaks have been trying to recover their reputation. Its reputation was justly destroyed for all their ignorance and abuse towards autism activists and academics. In 2021, Professor Simon Baron-Cohen of Cambridge University in the UK announced an autism study involving collecting the DNA of 10,000 participants. This immediately got autistic people to speak up and protest, as any DNA studies are like a dog whistle for ableist eugenics. The research team had a great lack of transparency concerning their intentions. 10,000 of autistic people signed a petition form to stop the study. Baron-Cohen eventually announced the aim was to better understand the genetic and environmental factors that cause so many autistic people to have mental health problems, epilepsy, and other common comorbidities. The main reason people signed the petition is it was not clear whether this was for eugenic purposes. Baron-Cohen claimed they had no intention of curing or eradicating autism. The NHS Health Research Team were bombarded with questions, complaints, and concerns by autistic people about the Spectrum 10K project. As a result, the project was paused. The sponsor of the National Health Research Team says, I quote, "The sponsor states that it is important to note that the study's principal investigators make a distinction between autism and severe neurodevelopmental disorders, the latter being disorders in which the individual may have developmental delays, intellectual disability, epilepsy, and or motor coordination difficulties, as well as potentially impaired development of other organs. They believe that it is important to distinguish seeking a cure or treatment for such co-occurring conditions from seeking a cure or treatment for autism itself. They would like to be clear that none of the PIs support seeking a cure or prevention of autism." End of quote. Despite the claim that this study is not looking for a cure to autism, and saying they must keep a distinction between autism and co-occurring conditions, but still eugenics against people with co-occurring disabilities, then by making prenatal tests to abort those fetuses, they are still aborting the autistic ones still. Whenever a study is trying to improve someone with a genetic basis, it inevitably becomes eugenics. while simultaneously implicating people with the disability in question are less human, needing to be fixed, known as ableism. Ever since autistic people got involved with autism research, one theory after another by ableists has gotten debunked. Saying to keep a clear distinction between autism and everything else, to me sounds just like an excuse. Because if the project makes the distinction, it is not actually about autism. So either the principal investigators were lying, or they're full of nonsense. I doubt it's the latter, considering they have the title Principal Investigator. Where they talk about development and developmental delay, another problem arises. Every human develops at a various pace from various stages. So which is the healthy way to develop? To me, all these so-called developmental milestones is a very disrespectful way to look at humans, as basically it's thinking that a human is actually a product of your own making. If someone's already got in mind what kind of baby they want, it automatically makes them less accepting of any children who don't meet their expectations. From my view, thinking of humans in this mechanical way only increases cultural prejudice and stigma. Someone called Caitlin Farrell from Cambridge said, I quote, "As the disabled student officer and myself an autistic person, I'd like to express my profound disappointment that Cambridge is involved in this research project. Whilst the project leaders claim to be against eugenics, attempts to find the genetic cause for autism are one step away from attempting to cure autism, in the face of autistic community's insistence that such a cure is both unwanted and essentially eugenic in intention and effect, that such large amounts of money have been invested in a project which self-admittedly has no real benefits for the autistic people taking part when services for autistic people remain underfunded. It is a disgrace." End of quote. There are three people I see as the pioneers of neurodiversity, turning from a limited political movement to scientific discourse. Judy Sinner popularized and started the neurodiversity movement. Nick Walker challenged the pathology paradigm by producing the neurodiversity paradigm. And the work of Damian Milton and Robert Chapman has reinforced neurodiversity as a scientific paradigm. It's often claimed that Judy Sinner was the one who made the term neurodiversity, but it was actually already made online by other autistic people, coming up with better terminology to describe autism. Sinner started a disability and social movement. What needs to be noticed is she only did it for people with what was called Asperger's syndrome at the time. Sinner modeled the term after biodiversity. Why not propose that just as biodiversity is essential to ecosystem stability, so neurodiversity may be essential for cultural stability, she wrote. Sinner's proposal went side by side with the autism rights movement, which started several years earlier when Jim Sinclair harshly targeted parents with his article Don't Mourn for Us, to create a cultural phenomenon that today informs every aspect of disability, philosophy, policy, and practice. Neurodiversity didn't go into the direction Judy Sinner envisioned. It turned into what she calls a Pollyanna Pangloss ideology that has little resemblance with what she planned. Sinner spent years supporting autistic people and their families. She started a group for adult children of parents with Asperger's, and later organized a support group for teenagers with the disorder. She felt deeply for the teasing, bullying, and discrimination in education and the workplace such individuals faced, and imagined a world in which they would not be expected to perform in ways for which they are simply not wired. For Singer, neurodiversity was another identity, like gender or race, with potentially enormous impacts that could best be understood through an intersectionality framework. Since things didn't go the way Singer imagined, she tossed the term neurodiversity away and made a new term, neurorealism. Judy Singer said, I quote, "When I tried to promote it recently, I got an avalanche of opposition. I understand because politically, the term realism has been hijacked by the political right, but it shouldn't be. You have to be realistic, meaning evidence-based, to survive in this world. If you can't swim and you go in the ocean, you're going to drown. That's realism. Neurorealism is a counter to Pollyanna Pangloss neurodiversity. It demands that we aim to meet the actual needs of everyone as they experience them, whether they consider themselves disabled or different." End of quote. By Singer popularizing the term neurodiversity, others were able to adopt it and take things further. Singer was more focused on her own family. She didn't actually intend to start a movement that supports all neurodivergent people. So she was outnumbered, in her view, to continue using ableist and dehumanizing language to describe the disabled people who were not part of her life. Dr. Nick Walker pointed out autism-related discourse was and still is seen as a form of pathology. She made what she termed the pathology paradigm. It frames neurominorities as forms of medical pathology or psychiatric disorder. As a result, disabled people were dehumanized and stigmatized by professionals. Nick Walker recognized that it follows the same pattern of racism and sexism. She compared neurominorities to social minorities and wrote that certain brains being classified as inferior is just like other forms of bigotry and discrimination. She then saw neurodiversity as another form of human diversity, then made the neurodiversity paradigm to oppose the stigmatizing pathology paradigm. Dr. Nick Walker said in an interview, I quote, "Just as humanity is ethnically diverse and diverse in terms of gender, sexual orientation, and numerous other qualities, humanity is also neurocognitively diverse, and autistics are a neurominority group. I coined the term neurominority a few years after Singer gave us the term neurodiversity. It seemed like an obvious extension of Singer's concept, and I'm sure others also came up with it independently." End of quote. Nick Walker began making other terms to try and update the neurodiversity paradigm, as people were still describing neurodiversity as diversity among brains. Walker saw that as outdated in scientific context and greatly reductionist, as it was decades behind modern understandings of how human body minds work. Someone called Kassane Autumuna made the term neurodivergent around the year 2000. To be neurodivergent is to diverge from the dominant cultural standards of neurocognitive functioning. Around 2010, Walker began writing scholarship and discourse papers about her two approaches to the biopsychosocial phenomenon of neurodiversity, referring to the pathology paradigm and the neurodiversity paradigm. Nick Walker said in the same interview, I quote, "The pathology paradigm starts from the assumption that significant divergences from dominant socio-cultural norms of cognition and embodiment represent some form of deficit, defect, or pathology. In other words, the pathology paradigm divides the spectrum of human cognitive and body performance into normal and other than normal, with normal implicitly privileged as the superior and desirable state. End of quote. From her perspective, the pathologization of neurominorities can be recognized as simply another form of systemic oppression, which functions similarly to the oppression of other types of minority groups. When looking from her perspective, the pathology paradigm generates systemic oppression like racism. It becomes easier to see that the concept of the normal mind is just as absurd as saying white people are the normal race. Nick Walker saw the neurodiversity movement as a movement to shift the culture's perspective away from pathologization towards neurodiversity. She doesn't see the movement as monolithic. She can see there's lots of ways to bring this cultural change, and that there's variation between how people interpret the concept of neurodiversity by different groups and individuals in the movement. Nick Walker has become optimistic as the first neurodiversity studies were published in the summer of 2020. Neurodiversity has emerged into a scientific discipline as well as a political social justice movement since 2012. Reality is beginning to catch up and overwrite the absurd normal mind, and there's going to be a lot more studies in this direction in the coming years. Part of the nature of the neurodiversity paradigm is that it can't be confined within the boundaries of a single field, not even a field of neurodiversity studies. Dr. Damian Milton is a sociologist and social psychologist who is an autism rights advocate and specializes in autism research and is a lecturer for autism and learning disabilities at the University of Kent. He also works as a consultant for the National Autistic Society. Milton's interest in autism began when his son was diagnosed as autistic when 2 years old in 2005. Later, Milton himself was diagnosed autistic in 2009, giving him an advantage by experience in autism as well as academia. Damian Milton is most well known in autism research for his double empathy problem. In 2012, Milton wrote, "Simply put, the theory of the double empathy problem suggests that when people with very different experiences of the world interact with one another, they will struggle to empathize with each other. This is likely to be exacerbated through differences in language use and comprehension. I first started to publish theoretical accounts of this issue in the early 2010s. Yet, similar ideas can be found in the work of Luke Bearden regarding cross-neurological theory of mind and in that of the philosopher Ian Hackett. More recently, research by Elizabeth Shepherd at the team at University of Nottingham, Brett Heisman at the London School of Economics, and Noah Sasson at the University of Texas at Dallas have shown that in experimental conditions, non-autistic people struggled to read the emotions of autistic participants or form negative first impressions of autistic people. Such evidence would suggest that the dominant psychological theories of autism are partial explanations at best." End of quote. Damian Milton examined past accounts and arguments voiced by autism activists in the autism rights movement, like Jim Sinclair from the 1990s. He then expanded on the accounts. Through careful examination, Milton was able to see numerous mentions of non-autistic people having a lack of understanding of autistic people. He was able to conclude that communication and interaction difficulties all move in both directions, as autism activists have been saying for decades already. Milton has co-authored hundreds of publications related to autism. His publications tend to be influenced by the social model of disability, just as is the neurodiversity movement. Milton deconstructs and critically analyzes past theories, like Nick Walker in America. For example, he agrees with other autistic people that harmless self-stimulatory behaviors, known as stimming, should be seen positively. According to the accounts of autistic people who experienced applied behavior analysis, restricting stimming only hurt them. Autistic people share stimming helps them concentrate, calm down, and pay attention. His work has been favorably received by the academic as well as the autistic community. He has spoken out against the Spectrum 10K project, questioning whether it truly was contributing to the well-being of autistic people. In summary, Judy Sinner popularized the term neurodiversity, arousing public and political interest. With Nick Walker in America and Damian Milton in Great Britain, there were people who specialized in autism research on both sides of the Atlantic. Nick Walker made an alternative paradigm to make a paradigm shift possible, and as Damian Milton has examined autism as pathology critically, the past theories have been proven wrong. With the past theories proven wrong scientifically, while neurodiversity activists in the movement are popularizing the concept of neurodiversity and disability acceptance, it is pushing and encouraging we should have a paradigm shift from Walker's pathology paradigm to the neurodiversity paradigm. While the neurodiversity movement was meant to be a political social justice movement stemming from the autism rights movement, it has expanded into scientific inquiry, scholarship, critical disability studies, and literature. At first, it was just about autistic people, but as it became more popularized, other forms of substantial neurodivergence have united, which has produced the neurodiversity paradigm, opposing the pathology paradigm. The neurodiversity paradigm proposes neurodiversity is an essential form of natural variation. It opposes the ideology that there is only one normal or healthy way of brain development and neurocognitive functioning. The idea that there's only one right way of brain development is no more valid than claiming there's only one right culture, gender, or race. Classifying uncommon variations as medical, psychiatric pathology has no valid scientific basis, and it's just a reflection of cultural prejudice. The social dynamics around neurodiversity are no different to the dynamics around other uncommon forms of human diversity. The neurodiversity paradigm opposes the belief that disability is caused by biological defects. Instead, neurodiversity works from a social model perspective, where disability is caused by society's failure to accommodate human needs. Neurodiversity is moving towards something called the social ecological model by PhD Robert Chapman to overcome the limitations of the medical and social models of disability. This may enable a paradigm shift away from the pathology paradigm in science discourse. PhD Robert Chapman said, I quote, Walker proposed a distinction between the pathology paradigm, which he took to be dominant and to rest on a relatively restricted conception of neurological, cognitive, and developmental normality, and the emerging neurodiversity paradigm, which begins from the acknowledgement that neurological diversity is natural and beneficial for the cognitive and cultural richness of the species. On this paradigm, instead of being labelled medically normal or abnormal, those who are more enabled in a given society are considered more neurotypical, while those who diverge further from functional norms are more neurodivergent. Walker argued that developing and cultivating such a paradigm shift to then be adopted for research, policy, and practice would be necessary for the long-term emancipation and well-being of neurodivergent individuals. End of quote. The neurodiversity paradigm does not agree groups of people should be defined by what they can't do, and is more of a strength-based approach. It's more wholesome by acknowledging both strengths and limitations. Unlike the anti-psychiatry movement, neurodiversity is not in denial of the existence of biological defects. The medical model and social model of disability are two extremes. Neurodiversity is more of a neutral ground, not leaning to one or the other, but is central. The social model dismisses biology, and the medical model dismisses all societal problems. There are both biological and societal issues which need to be addressed. Neurodiversity enables us to untangle and make a distinction between what issues are caused by biological defects and societal causes. If we look at double empathy, we can see the communication and interaction difficulties autistic people experience is not because of the biological defect, but emerges from groups of people who are struggling to empathize with each other. So the solution is for autistic and non-autistic people to learn how to understand each other. We don't need to prescribe any drugs or do conversion therapy. The neurodiversity paradigm can bring a stop to all the unscientific, stigmatizing language in the literature. Neurodivergence has been described as disorder, deficit, deficient, etc. kind of language, and creates inequality and inaccuracy as mentioned before. Statistics do not reflect reality. If we think of someone who has a difficulty with language comprehension, they would be described as someone with language deficiency, which is stigmatizing and inaccurate. At birth, no baby can speak in sentences, so we can say they have language deficiency. It's not described as a deficiency because they can learn to speak. Children who don't start speaking until the age of 4 can learn to speak. So it's invalid to claim that a disabled person has language deficiency. Autistic people have great detail discrimination, which non-autistic people greatly lack. The pathology paradigm would say non-autistic people have detail deficiency. The fact disabled people's difficulties are stigmatized and non-disabled people's difficulties aren't stigmatized illustrates the prejudice and social inequality in the science community caused by the pathology paradigm. Pathologizing difficulties with language like deficient is actually counterproductive. Ideas of deficit could lower the expectations of disabled individuals and those around them, and low expectations have been found to predict less capability. In psychology, this is called the self-expectancy effect, people conforming to what they expect of themselves. Therefore, through a neurodiversity lens, we should use respectful language to describe disabled people, even if the disabled individual is to have access to interventions that could help them learn new skills. The disabled individual should not feel they are deficient, but that they are accepted and valued as they are. The challenges neurodivergence causes can and should of course be acknowledged along with strengths, but there is a considerable difference between acknowledging that someone experiences challenges, then pathologizing everything about them, and acknowledging someone's challenges while valuing their strengths. Eric Fromm from the Sane Sanity says, I quote, "The fact that millions of people share the same vices does not make these vices virtues. The fact that they share so many errors does not make the errors to be truths. and the fact that millions of people share the same forms of mental pathology does not make these people sane. End of quote. The neurodiversity paradigm has put research not just for autism, but numerous other disabilities in crisis. People are afraid to enter such fields because they know they will be shunned publicly if they say anything that offends neurodivergent people and have their name thrown all across the internet as a Nazi. They can suddenly be shunned as the worst person in the world. The ignorance of so-called normal people has given neurodivergent people an advantage because of the oppressive practices. By forcing neurodivergent people to understand how non-disabled people think, we know the tricks of our opposers, but so-called normal people don't bother learning how to understand the neurodivergent people, and as a result, they are not prepared for debate. Rhetoric works in more than one way. Which way you use depends on your goal. Neurodivergent activists use a kind which can be compared to the slashing of a knife. There's questions that open up a dialogue between the two people, but there's another which is not about dialogue, but aims to be provocative. Depending on the case, there is sometimes a logical fallacy called the Gish Gallop. When I ask questions, I am not always desiring an answer. I desire the person I'm asking to think about what I point out. Just to give you an example, I sometimes declare and ask opposers, you claim you agree all people are equal in value. How can you be telling me the truth when you claim we should not allow disabled people into the world if we are equals? Why? Then they can never answer me. That question alone does not open dialogue for a discussion. It rather pushes them into the corner as people who are internally inconsistent with their beliefs and views. They often give the answer, but they'll have a low quality of life. I then just say back, what is quality of life? They give an answer, then I say, I disagree. I love being autistic. So who's right? Can you see how each of my responses are questions that rather slashes their answers by them being unanswerable questions that I'm asking? How the answers are always subjective and opinionated. It just takes asking those kinds of questions to researchers. It immediately shows their research is ideological and biased, meaning it is not scientific. Considering all the abuse neurodivergent people have had to endure for nearly 2 centuries now, is it any wonder we are demanding the right to be ourselves? Reproductive technology is only further evidence that the eugenics movement has not ceased, that there are still eugenicists among our population. Neurodivergent people are here because we are supposed to be here. You're going to have to come to the realization that the ideology of normal people is the whole cause of the abuse we face. It is not our responsibility to adapt to a neurotypical world. All people have a responsibility to be mutual with one another, not just the disabled. As long as the eugenics movement continues with modern biotechnology, the neurodiversity movement will continue. The eugenics movement is a political movement. The neurodiversity movement is a counter movement. Counter movements can't occur without another movement. The neurodiversity movement is ongoing because it is countering the eugenics movement. There's the evidence that eugenics movement never did cease and still has not ceased. Anyone who sees one embryo as more preferable than another reveals they have eugenic ideology. If someone saw all people as equals, they would see all embryos as equals. Saying one embryo is more preferable implies people doing eugenics think which human bird-chosen embryo grows into is more valuable than the human that other embryo would have grown to be. Embryo selection is no different to selective breeding. The eugenics movement is continuing right in front of us, and people possibly haven't even realized they're practicing eugenics. As Eisenhower warned, at any time that power is consolidated in the hands of a few, we must guard against its potential abuse. Eisenhower saw inherent danger and hidden cost in the tempting profitability of the military-industrial complex. He feared that the industry would be driven not by the interest of national security, but rather by the interest of private and corporate profitability. He also feared that the human costs of military proliferation would be regarded as insignificant in the face of its profitability. End of quote. As Alicia Broderick has shared, Eisenhower's warning, with the power of genetic knowledge in the hands of lawmakers, we must guard against them holding the power to stop the eugenics movement. This abuse against disabled people has got to stop. Seeing and treating disabled people as equals is clearly insignificant to the eugenicists in the face of its profitability. We need to preserve neurodivergence. When we assess the strengths of neurodivergent people, we can see our world would be impoverished without them. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening for so long. And I'll see you on the next episode.